Welcome to the Department of Politics Roundtable. Today we're talking with Dr. Adam Chamberlain, Associate Professor of Politics, and Dr. Caitlin Sidorsky, Assistant Professor of Politics. And we're going to be discussing the current 2016 presidential election and particularly looking from both the Trump and the Clinton perspective on a variety of issues. So welcome, and thank you, Adam and Caitlin.
Thank you.
So the first question I'm going to kind of go to Dr. Chamberlain. Donald Trump has often accused the media of bias, and particularly in thinking about public opinion polls, he often says these polls are wrong or these internet polls are right. So how inaccurate or how accurate is his assessment of both the media bias and polling?
Sure. I think in terms of polling, we'll start there because I think that the polling really helps to shape what the media is discussing. And right now we see that Donald Trump is certainly down in the polls compared to Hillary Clinton across a range of factors. And so we would expect right about now, and I think I checked this morning, he's down about 3.5 to 3 percentage points in the poll. Earlier, before the debate, he was trending upward, but during the campaign, these fluctuations happen. After the debate, he seemed to go down again. So in that sense, I think the polls are relatively accurate. It appears that Hillary nationally has a couple percentage point lead on him, let's say 2.5 to 3.5%. When it comes to the media's reporting, then obviously, you have to realize the media is going to look for something that's easy to talk about. And frankly, Donald Trump makes it easy to talk about him.
Sure.
And so at that time, the framing of his issues and the positions, the way they present him might not be what he wants. But I don't really think that there's a lot of bias going on in the sense that I don't think the media is underplaying Donald Trump's potential success. I think they're actually being pretty accurate about where he is in the polls and where he is in the presidential race.
Excellent. Dr. Sidorsky, what do you think the Clinton campaign, how do you think they react to that or their position on this idea of media bias or polls?
So I think they would definitely agree in terms of media bias, right? So there was a Washington Post article that came out on September 20th, and it was about a data source that looked at 22,000 news articles and headlines from major news organizations, and it showed exactly what you would expect when the email scandal come out. It's more negative about Hillary Clinton. When Donald Trump says something maybe a little scandalous, then it trends downward for him as well. So it seems to be that when something negative happens to the candidates, then the media becomes more negative. That being said, more conservative newspapers tend to speak more favorably about Donald Trump, and this follows research in political science, and more liberal newspapers tend to be a little bit more favorable to Hillary Clinton. So in terms of media bias, it's pretty much been trending exactly as how you would expect. I think what's a little bit different this time around is that more news media outlets are coming out and either saying that they are for or not for a particular candidate, right? So, we see USA Today, which doesn't come out and say in past presidential elections whether or not they're going to support a candidate. While they don't say they're going to support Clinton, they do say, I don't want you to vote for Trump, right? So I think for those instances, that I think is what makes it a little bit more unique now than perhaps in the past. But in terms of just general trends, bias has not really been in place as much as I think Donald Trump would like you to believe.
Yeah. So kind of on that theme, some of the newspapers and media outlets that have endorsed Secretary Clinton in particular have spoken about Donald Trump's temperament or his lack of experience in politics. And so kind of going off of that question, based on their experience, based on their kind of campaigning, which candidate do you think is best positioned to be able to work with Congress? So kind of switching from campaigning to governing.
So I think Hillary Clinton has an edge on that. I mean, she's not only been in Congress, so she has those networks already. Her husband was a former president who has worked with Congress, so I think she can see some of the potential pitfalls that are going to come your way. What's a good idea and what's a bad idea. On the other hand, I think it very much depends on what this Congress, next Congress looks like, right? Are we having divided government where, Republicans are still in control and she wins the presidency and we have a Democrat in office, then, odds are that she's not going to get a lot accomplished that she wants to, right? So I think in general, she has an edge only because she has that experience, not only personally working in Congress, but being, on the sidelines of history for her own husband, right? Whereas Donald Trump really doesn't have that type of connection.
Sure. Dr. Chamberlain?
Yeah, I would agree with Caitlin's assessment on this. I think Donald Trump will run into some problems because of his temperament. And I say this looking at state governors as an example. And the person that comes to mind is Jesse the Body Ventura, governor of Minnesota, Reform Party governor.
Right.
But as a person who was an outsider to politics for most of his life, although he had been a mayor of a city prior to that, his way of handling the legislature was not very nice. He thought he could strong-arm them at times. He treated them with indifference in many cases. And he didn't understand how to work to get legislation passed, and especially legislation that has to be there, such as a budget. And I see that some of those similarities are present in the personality and the persona that Donald Trump puts out there. And I could envision it where the Republicans in Congress sometimes find it difficult to work with their own president and might actually push them into the arms of the Democrats to try to figure out a way to get something through that could could come through an override of a presidential veto if something came down to it.
Interesting. So there may be kind of a backlash in some ways.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think Jimmy Carter had a little bit of this, right, when he was president. Even though he might not have had the temperament issues that Donald Trump had, he came in and he had Democratic support, and he could not work with his own party.
Yep.
So I think, governors, I think Jimmy Carter's another really good example of sometimes even your own party will not be in that much support of you.
Sure,
Yep.
yeah. Well, and maybe that goes kind of to the next question, which is about popularity, because in this election, we have two candidates that are unpopular with large sections of the population. And that tends to create this idea that there's even more cynicism about politics than there would be in a normal year. So do you think that's true? Is there more cynicism this cycle than before? And if that's the case, if there is, do you think that's a permanent trend, or do you think it's just an aberration?
I think that the cynicism aspect has been on the uptick in recent years. And so that's not something that's necessarily new to this election cycle. I think that in this particular election, cynicism might have increased some, but we still see that a lot of these people, Republicans and Democrats, are backing the candidate from their party. And especially on the Republican side, where there is some animosity directed towards Donald Trump, a lot of that seems to be more elites and activists, people, a small segment of the population that's involved. When we look at poll numbers, it seems that the general average Republican voter is lining up behind Donald Trump. And even if it's not their first choice, they're still willing to do it. So cynicism can't be that high. Now, maybe on election day, we'll see that not as many people show up to vote. Maybe we'll see a decrease in turnout that could be evidence of cynicism. But at least at this point, I think that it's not anything special to this election.
Interesting. Dr.
Yeah.
Sidorsky?
I would agree with that. I mean, think back really not too long ago, and you have a president, JFK, saying in his inauguration speech, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And there's a whole generation that is about political activism and going and working for government. And really, ever since that, the decade of the '60s, we just see a really large decrease in satisfaction in government and trust in government, and a large increase in cynicism of government. Right? It's a really big problem that young Americans don't want to go into public service. They don't want to run for public office. That's men and women alike, and they don't want to work for the government. Period. Right? They don't want to go into the civil service. And so I think that this is just a trend that's been happening for quite a long time in our history, since the 1960s, of just this general trend of, I don't know if really government's really the answer. And, in the 1980s, Reagan capitalizes on this. He says, government isn't the solution, it's the
Right.
problem. And so I think all of that rhetoric and a lot of the blame on Congress and presidents, it just breeds this feeling of that, government is inadequate and it can't do the right things. And I think that is being capitalized on by Donald Trump this election, right? I think that's why when he says, we'll make America great again, he's, trying to say we're harking back to a time when, government was good and, you should want to go into government. And I think that's powerful for a lot of people. That's why I think he has, his, core group of people, and why Republicans are coming back into the fold, even if they're saying they weren't that big of a fan of him to begin with. They like that rhetoric. That's very powerful to them. So I don't know if I would say that it's a new trend. I'd say it's a trend that's continued, and I think it's just, until something big changes, I think it's just going to kind of continue going in this direction.
So in political science, of course, we have this idea of public mood, something that it's hard to measure, but we know it's there and in which way it's trending. And it seems that maybe some of that public mood is often dependent on what we think of as identity politics. And that's been a prominent theme in this year's election, and particularly thinking about Identity in politics specific to gender, but also there have been issues of race as well in this particular election. So, Dr. Sidorsky, women in politics is one of your specialties. How has the gender identity issue affected both candidates in this election?
So it's interesting because it almost seems like from the women in politics perspective that the gender identity has affected Donald Trump more than it's affected Hillary Clinton. There's been very little talk about her being, the first female presidential nominee from one of the two major parties. There's been very little talk about what a female president would look like, which is really interesting, because, not just 8 years ago we were facing, the first African-American president, and, we had questions galore of, is this the end to racism in America, and what does this mean for race politics? And that's not really being discussed in terms of, gender politics in this country for Hillary Clinton poised to be the next president. I do think it's affected Donald Trump more only because of his comments, right? A lot of people, say he's sexist, he's a misogynist. He, unfortunately, he doesn't tend to back away from statements and apologize for what he says. He tends to further, go down a certain pathway and defend himself. And so I think for him, he's just really hurting his chances at the female vote. Republicans already have a hard time getting the female vote. Republicans are more likely to be men, more likely to be white. Democrats are more likely to be women. And so I think by those comments, he just pushes the female vote further and further into the Hillary camp, not because she's a woman, but just because she just doesn't say these types of things. It might be interesting to look at it from the perspective in terms of gender politics that, here they're vying for literally the most masculine office in our country, right? You cannot get, a more masculine office maybe besides a governor.
Right.
And the fact that he's so macho, right, may just continue to reinforce that this is a masculine office. And I don't think we'll really understand until the election's over if that has had any impact on Hillary Clinton, whether or not her gender has really mattered. Studies have shown that gender tends not to matter so much in other elections, but this is the first of its kind, right? So we don't know exactly what's going to happen, with her in terms of any type of bias from voters or of bias from the media.
Dr. Chamberlain, identity politics, what do you think?
I think I'll build on the Donald Trump aspect here because really his campaign is targeted toward white males, in large part. And I think that that's going to be one of the reasons that in the long term, the Republican Party is going to look back at this election and say, maybe this worked in the short term, maybe not, but that this isn't a good long-term strategy. Just based on simple demographics, the country's moving in a direction away from that. White men will make up a smaller portion of the population. That's really what the Republican base is pulling on. And I know that after 2012, we saw people like Newt Gingrich come out and talk about how Republicans needed to make inroads with Latinos. We saw that Bush, the second Bush, made inroads with that group in 2000, 2004, and that the Republicans have lost some of that. Even in public opinion polls that we're getting back now, the African-American vote projected for Trump is somewhere around 1%, which is even lower than what we've seen for other Republican presidential candidates, which is a low bar to begin with.
Sure.
And so this is certainly not improving that particular kind of identity politics focus for the Republicans. They need to figure out what they're going to do to reach out to other demographics besides the one that is their core constituency. And at least in the short term, this could work for Trump, but the trends as they look in the future, this isn't a strategy that the Republicans are going to want to copy in the future.
Sure. So, we've had such a dramatic kind of entertainment-focused election in many ways. On the top of the ticket, the vice presidential candidates have flown under the radar a little bit throughout the entire campaign cycle. Dr. Chamberlain, what do you think each of the vice presidential candidates brings to their respective ticket?
Sure. I think that looking at the two vice presidential candidates just from the start, recent poll numbers have shown that somewhere around a quarter to maybe more, over a quarter of Americans either don't know or have no opinion about the vice presidential candidates, which is probably a reason why the debate coming up with the vice presidential candidates maybe could increase their exposure. So at this point, I don't think either have added that much to the ticket. They have the ability to do so in a couple of ways. Mike Pence, for Donald Trump on the Republican side, brings with him experience as a governor. It at least brings some stability, and it's some reason that Republicans can look at the ticket and say, well, even if the presidential candidate is not experienced, we have someone with executive branch experience. On the opposite side, with the Democrats having Tim Kaine, you have someone that can appeal to potentially more moderate independent voters or independent-leaning Democrats. And additionally, having a white male on the ticket at least brings in potentially some of those voters who might be thinking about looking at Trump, part of the Republican constituency. So I think they have the ability to bring that in. I just don't think they've capitalized on that yet.
Interesting. Dr. Sidorsky.
Yeah, so I think Mike Pence for Donald Trump brings in those social conservatives in a way that maybe Donald Trump just doesn't do himself, right? You know, so I don't know if I would describe Donald Trump, you know, off the bat as a social conservative, but Mike Pence certainly is. So I think he provides, you know, reaches out to a certain core part of the Republican Party that Donald Trump really needs to win, you know, the presidency. I think for Hillary Clinton, Tim Kaine is not controversial, right? You know, he's pretty, you know, they describe him as, you know, a nice guy. Some people describe him as maybe a little boring, but he's a nice, non-controversial guy for a candidate who has had some problems with trust, right? You know, and emails and Benghazi and all these questions of can you be trusted, and you know, all those things are controversial in and of themselves. I think Tim Kaine kind of brings a bit of normalcy and non-controversial, good experience, good leadership, you know, that she can rely upon to say, you know, we're a good team. Both of us have a lot of experience and we can both be trusted. My record shows for it, and so does, you know, my nominee Tim Kaine as well. So I think that's what either candidate brings for both, and I think that they're important aspects for both campaigns.
So turning to this issue of trust, that's been a major issue in the campaign as we think about honesty on both sides for both candidates, and whether or not you can trust a candidate who has never held elected office, because it's difficult to determine based, you know, on no record what they would do. But how do you think trust will play out in the voting booth?
I think at least looking at how this works, most voters are going to put their trust in the party identification first. That's probably not a good thing looking at the two candidates. They probably do need to think more about what these candidates have done or have not done in their past. The one saving grace, and it's probably something voters aren't considering, is the fact that a Republican president, a Democratic president, is going to have people put in place around them as advisors who are probably more skilled than they are in those particular areas, more so with Donald Trump than Hillary Clinton, who has experience in the executive branch. But those advisors are going to help shape that. Do we think that some people might be less trusting of the presidency depending on who wins? Certainly. I think that we could see that more Americans are less trusting of the president, you know, the executive branch and the president after the election than we've seen in the past, simply because there are questions that have been raised about Hillary's trustworthiness and her honesty. And there are certainly questions, given Donald Trump's personality and how he's approached the election, that could lead voters and the American public in general to be a little less trusting.
Dr. Sidorsky, what do you think about this issue of trust for both candidates?
So I wonder if what's going to happen is it's just not going to get people to the voting booth, right? I feel like the ground game and get out the vote efforts are going to make or break this election, because so many people seem to be dissatisfied with both candidates, and trust has to do a lot with this for why they just are not satisfied. And so I am curious as to whether or not the trust issue is just going to keep people at home on election day, because neither candidate just does it for them, you know, right, and for a lot of different reasons. And so I think the turnout, I think, will either be a little higher than normal, because, you know, people will be vehemently against one of the other candidate, and even if they're not happy with the candidate they choose, they're going to choose one. Or it's going to be, I think, a bit low, because people are going to say, I just was not given a candidate that I liked. I've heard a lot of people say, you know, can we just go back to this process and start over again, because I don't really like any of the candidates. Right. And, you know, you have to say, no, this is the way we head now, so this is the decision you have to make, which for some is just not palatable.
Sure. And Dr. Sidorsky, this kind of issue of trust, we think about it domestically, but we don't think about what it means on the world stage, on the global stage. You know, as we think about the fact that the world closely watches American elections for a variety of reasons, do you think that this election has affected negatively our reputation or other countries' perceptions of American elections or politics, whether they be enemies or allies?
So I think definitely it's garnered a lot of attention, right? So it's not just, the 84 million people who watched the first debate here, it's, the millions of people who watched the debate around the world. So I think the world is closely watching to see who wins, and even though both candidates may not exactly do what needs to be done in terms of foreign policy, I think a lot of countries, particularly democratic countries in Europe, are incredibly nervous about a Trump president. And not just for their own countries, but for their own elections, right? So Angela Merkel's coming up to a re-election soon, and a Trump presidency could very much affect what happens in her country. I think people, when we're dealing with elections in our country, we forget that whatever happens here, echoes elsewhere.
Sure.
So there's going to be some type of foreign policy that's going to be put in place, and Germany and Great Britain and France, they all have, some of them have important elections coming up. A lot of them are part of NATO, and changes in foreign policy, both for specific countries and also for international organizations, are going to have a big impact. And so I think that maybe it's not negative yet, but depending upon where we kind of fall, who becomes elected, I think it could be a pretty negative viewpoint from a lot of our Democratic allies of, what were you thinking from their perspective, especially for those who are running for re-election.
So this kind of idea of national, global, international trends, maybe Brexit as a harbinger of Trump, or Trump as a harbinger of Brexit, and then maybe other subsequent elections globally. What do you think, Dr. Chamberlain?
Sure. I think this is the proper way of viewing it, is that Hillary Clinton's experience is safe. Regardless of what's been done in the past, other world leaders are going to look at her and understand that she has experience as Secretary of State. And that's good in terms of international relations. Trump's going to have problems and issues dealing with a number of world leaders. First off, he's going to have troubles dealing within this hemisphere with Mexico and with Justin Trudeau in Canada, who seems to not be terribly interested, I think, in the type of personality that Trump brings to the table. Likewise, the bombastic statements about China, I think, is something that's also going to be detrimental. This is something that I think clearly, Senator Clinton, Secretary of State Clinton, and now presidential candidate Clinton is going to have a lot of experience with. And so I think she'd be better suited for handling that, and especially those growing economies in parts of Asia. So when it comes down to it, just given the amount of time she's been around the executive branch in Washington, D.C., when it comes to foreign affairs, that's what you need. Put aside domestic policy. You just need exposure and experience with it, and that's what she has. Trump doesn't, and he doesn't have those connections that you need to have in office to be a strong foreign policy leader.
So, Dr. Chamberlain, kind of switching gears in thinking about not issues abroad and not the campaign more generally, but thinking very narrowly about young voters in the United States. And many young voters became incredibly energized during the primary season, particularly on the Democratic side with Bernie Sanders. And given that that Senator Sanders didn't achieve his goal and didn't win the nomination, what do you think happens with these young voters in the general election? Do they go to Trump, do they go to Clinton, or do they go somewhere else?
Sure. I think that's actually a very good question, probably one that's difficult to answer. We know that young voters can be inspired. Barack Obama's campaign in 2008 certainly did that. But in this particular situation where you have Bernie Sanders losing in the primary, in a range of those individuals, younger, who are looking at the choices, don't really feel like they fit in there. Some are probably going to line up behind Hillary Clinton. Others are probably going to stay home, and still others might look for a third-party option. But it's very difficult to say exactly how many will stay home, because we know that younger voters are more mobile. They're oftentimes away at college, or they're in a new location, haven't registered to vote. They need absentee ballots. And given all of those, I won't say inconsistencies, but problems in trying to analyze it, I wouldn't want to project and say that we're going to see a lot of them stay home or a lot of them turn out. It's one of those demographics that's harder to pinpoint. And the campaigns know this, which might be why they're not focusing as much attention this year on the youth vote, because they realize it's an unpredictable voter base.
Yeah. Dr. Sidorsky.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind that, even when Bernie Sanders was saying a lot of things that young voters liked and was targeting them heavily, on primary day, they still weren't turning out nearly as much, as their parents and their grandparents. And, same for general elections. So I think, it's hard to say what's going to happen with young voters because most of them don't tend to come out to vote to begin with. I suspect that more will tend to go to Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump. I think this, generation is about, cultural openness and about, advancement and representation. And I think that, if it speaks to anyone to have a female, in office, it speaks to this group of voters, who's about, acceptance, who grew up. This is an interesting generation. Half of it, right? A good portion of it is alive and remembers 9/11, and some portion of it, learns about it in history books. And so it's a very interesting generation that, I think is more about openness and, representation, and maybe that will speak to them more about having the first female candidate as opposed to electing Donald Trump.
Interesting. I'm going to spring one last surprise question on you guys. They didn't know this was coming, so and that is. Everyone enjoys talking about politics, and we all get interested in it in this time of year, and every 4 years in particular with presidential elections. As political scientists, not just as voters or citizens, right, but as political scientists, what has either surprised you or interested you the most about this election?
That's actually a very good question. I'll say that what surprised me the most has been the way in which the political party primaries ran, especially the number of Republican candidates and the Democratic candidates being controlled, but being one quite ideological, the other a little more moderate than the other. I think that the Republicans have always tried to push candidates upon people and say, if candidates want to run, we'll fund them, we'll do the campaign for them. And we've seen that now a lot of Republican politicians really believe they have the ability to do more than what they're already doing. Ambition abounds in the Republican Party, and the Republican Party has to find a way to control that in the future. Not every politician that gets into the Senate, not every politician who's been governor should run for president. On the Democratic side, it was Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, a non-Democrat, and then Martin O'Malley and Lincoln Chafee were kind of like on the fringes there. They have a lack of people willing to push in there, and there seems to be too much deference towards people with political experience moving on. And so I think the Democrats need to do a better job of finding and locating those people who really do have the governing experience that want to compete. Not to say that Hillary wouldn't have won still, because she was probably the most qualified candidate at that time, but there might have to find a way to drum up a little more support going forward. Yeah. And so that's what's interested me the most about the election.
Oh. Dr. Sidorsky, as a political scientist, what's the most interesting or surprising thing to you?
So I think the most surprising thing to me, because I study women in politics, is just how gender has played out in this election. In the past, you may, touch on people's implicit bias, for gender or particularly for race, but it was never okay, right, to come right out and say something racist or, sexist. And that hasn't been the case in this election. And yet, despite those things being said, right, you'll hear voter interviews and they'll say, hey, I don't agree with him saying, X about African Americans or the African American community, or Y about women or about that particular women. But I'm going to ignore that in favor of his general idea that we need to change this country, because I agree we need to change this country. And so I think it's just been incredibly interesting how I think playing on certain fears of voters, right? Which, I think for a lot of people out there, it's this fear that, we've lost our way, we're just not the same country, we don't know where we're heading, we don't have maybe the, greatest perspective on the world, or the world doesn't have a good perspective on us. And that despite maybe some really hateful comments that a candidate may say, we're still going to support him, and particularly, right, women of the Republican Party who still support a candidate who says these things. It's really interesting from a women in politics perspective that someone can attack your identity, and it's not an identity that is called upon in certain points of your life. You live with that identity every single day, and you can still get support for it. I think that's been really interesting in this election for me.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you both, Dr. Adam Chamberlain, Dr. Caitlin Storsky. Thank you for joining us for the Department of Politics Roundtable, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.